Dawn over Iron Bottom Sound. The first light of dawn on November 13th, 1942, crept across the waters of what the sailors had begun calling Iron Bottom Sound, a name that spoke to the metal graveyard resting beneath these deceptively peaceful waves. The Solomon Islands stretched like emerald jewels across the Coral Sea, their tropical beauty masking one of the most contested waterways in the Pacific War. Here, between the mountainous bulk of Guadalcanal and the smaller islands of Tulagi and Florida, American and Japanese naval forces had been locked in a deadly dance for months, each side determined to control this crucial stretch of water that would determine the fate of Henderson Field and perhaps the entire Pacific campaign. Captain Gilbert Hoover stood on the bridge of the USS Helena, watching the horizon lighten from deep purple to pale gold. The light cruiser cut through the calm waters with practiced efficiency, her 6-inch guns trained skyward in anticipation. Hoover was a methodical man, a product of the Naval Academy who understood that successful naval operations depended as much on logistics and intelligence as on courage and firepower. At 47, he had spent his career preparing for moments like this, though nothing in his peacetime experience had quite prepared him for the brutal arithmetic of night fighting in these confined waters. The Helena herself was a testament to American industrial resilience. Damaged at Pearl Harbor on that infamous December morning, she had been rebuilt and reinforced, emerging from the shipyards with enhanced radar capabilities and improved fire control systems. Her crew of 800 men had trained relentlessly in the months since, learning to operate as a single organism in the chaos of night combat. They knew their ship's capabilities intimately. Her maximum speed of 33 knots, her range of 13,000 yards with the main battery, the precise timing required to reload and fire her 5 turrets in coordinated salvos. But technical specifications, Hoover knew, told only part of the story. The real challenge lay in understanding the enemy's intentions and capabilities. And here, American intelligence was still learning hard lessons about Japanese naval doctrine and technology. The Imperial Japanese Navy had spent years perfecting night-fighting techniques, training their crews to operate in darkness with a precision that had caught American forces off guard in earlier engagements. Their destroyers were faster and more maneuverable than their American counterparts, equipped with the devastating Type 93 torpedo, a weapon whose range and destructive power had only recently become apparent to Allied naval intelligence. The strategic importance of Guadalcanal had crystallized over the past 4 months into a contest of wills that neither side could afford to lose. For the Americans, Henderson Field represented the first major offensive operation in the Pacific, a foothold that could serve as a launching point for future advances toward the Japanese home islands. The airfield's bombers and fighters could interdict Japanese supply lines and provide crucial air support for ground operations throughout the Solomons chain. Losing Guadalcanal would mean abandoning the initiative and potentially allowing Japanese forces to threaten Australia and New Zealand. For the Japanese, the island represented something equally vital, the southern anchor of their defensive perimeter and a critical link in their supply lines to the resource-rich territories they had conquered in the Dutch East Indies and Southeast Asia. More importantly, Guadalcanal had become a matter of prestige and strategic momentum. The Japanese High Command had committed significant resources to retaking the island, viewing it as essential to maintaining their image of invincibility and their ability to dictate the terms of any eventual peace settlement. The waters around Guadalcanal had already witnessed several major naval engagements, each one a learning experience written in blood and steel. The Battle of Savo Island in August had demonstrated Japanese superiority in night fighting, resulting in the loss of 4 Allied heavy cruisers and serious damage to American confidence in their tactical doctrine. The Battle of the Eastern Solomons, later that month, had shown that American air power could inflict serious damage on Japanese carrier forces. But it had also revealed the limitations of daylight operations in waters dominated by enemy land-based aircraft. Captain Hoover understood these lessons intimately. He had studied the after-action reports, analyzed the tactical decisions that had led to both victories and defeats. The key, he had concluded, lay in maximizing American advantages in radar technology and fire control, while minimizing exposure to Japanese torpedoes and superior night fighting skills. This meant maintaining formation discipline, coordinating fire effectively, and avoiding the kind of confused melee that had characterized earlier engagements. The Helena's radar operators had been tracking contacts throughout the night, ghost images that appeared and disappeared on their screens as atmospheric conditions shifted and enemy formations maneuvered beyond the horizon. The technology was still relatively new, and interpreting the signals required both technical skill and tactical intuition. A large contact might be a battleship or a group of destroyers in close formation. A fast-moving blip could indicate an enemy torpedo attack or simply interference from weather conditions. The radar provided crucial information, but it required human judgment to transform that information into actionable intelligence. As the dawn light strengthened, Hoover could make out the silhouettes of other American ships in his task force, destroyers and cruisers arranged in a formation designed to maximize their combined firepower while providing mutual protection against torpedo attacks. Each captain commanded his vessel independently, but their actions were coordinated through a complex system of radio communications and predetermined tactical plans. The success of their mission would depend on their ability to function as a unified force while adapting to the chaos and confusion of combat. The intelligence briefings had painted a picture of Japanese intentions that was both clear and troubling. Enemy forces were planning another major attempt to reinforce their garrison on Guadalcanal, using the cover of darkness to run supplies and fresh troops down what the Americans had dubbed the slot, the narrow channel between the Solomon Islands that provided the most direct route to Henderson Field. Japanese naval forces would provide escort and fire support, potentially including battleships capable of bombarding the American airfield into uselessness. The timing of these operations followed a pattern that American intelligence had begun to recognize. Japanese supply runs typically occurred during the new moon phase, when natural darkness provided maximum concealment from American air attacks. The enemy would approach at high speed during the evening hours, conduct their operations under cover of darkness, and withdraw before dawn brought the inevitable response from Henderson Field's aircraft. It was a strategy that minimized Japanese vulnerabilities while maximizing pressure on American ground forces. But it also created opportunities for American naval forces to intercept and engage under conditions that might favor superior radar and fire control technology. Hoover's orders were straightforward in concept, but complex in execution. His task force was to intercept Japanese naval forces attempting to bombard Henderson Field, engaging them before they could complete their mission while avoiding the kind of prolonged engagement that might expose American ships to daylight air attacks. Success would require precise timing, effective coordination, and more than a little luck, factors that could not be controlled through planning alone. The captain's thoughts turned to his crew, young men from farms and cities across America who had volunteered or been drafted into a war they were still learning to fight. Many had never seen the ocean before joining the Navy, let alone participated in the kind of high-intensity combat that had become routine in these waters. Their training had been thorough, but necessarily abbreviated, compressed into months, what had traditionally taken years to master. Yet they had performed admirably in previous engagements, adapting to the demands of modern naval warfare with the resilience and ingenuity that Hoover had come to expect from American sailors. The morning air carried the scents of tropical vegetation and salt spray, a reminder that this beautiful archipelago had become a battleground where the future of the Pacific would be decided. Somewhere beyond the horizon, Japanese naval forces were making their own preparations, following their own tactical doctrines and strategic imperatives. The outcome of their encounter would depend not just on courage and determination, but on the accumulated lessons of previous battles and the ability of both sides to adapt their tactics to the realities of modern warfare. Saratari, life aboard the Helena. For the men aboard the Helena, the hours between engagements fell into patterns that had become second nature over months of Pacific warfare. The morning watch began at 0400 hours, when the first light of dawn would reveal whether the night had brought new threats to their anchorage. Seaman First Class Rodriguez moved through the familiar routine of checking ammunition stores, counting shells that might mean the difference between victory and defeat in the next engagement. Each round of 6-inch ammunition weighed nearly 100 pounds, and the ship carried over 1,000 of them, stacked in magazines deep below the waterline where they would be relatively safe from enemy fire. The Helena's crew had learned to read the subtle signs that preceded action. when the ship's laundry stopped taking in uniforms, when the galley began serving sandwiches instead of hot meals, when the medical officers started laying out surgical instruments in sickbay. These were the indicators that told experienced sailors to write letters home and check their life jackets. But between these moments of preparation came long stretches of routine maintenance that kept a complex warship functioning in the corrosive environment of the tropical Pacific. Chief Petty Officer Williams supervised the daily ritual of cleaning the ship's main battery. The 6-inch guns required constant attention. Salt spray could corrode the mechanisms that elevated and trained the weapons, and a gun that failed to fire at the crucial moment could doom the entire ship. Williams had served on cruisers for 15 years, and he understood that naval gunnery was as much about mechanical precision as it was about courage under fire. The Helena's 15 6-inch guns could fire at a rate of 10 rounds per gun per minute, but only if every component functioned perfectly when the order came to commence firing. Admiral William Bull Halsey had taken command of South Pacific operations with a mandate that reflected the changing American approach to the Guadalcanal campaign. Where his predecessor had been cautious, Halsey was aggressive. Where previous commanders had sought to avoid losses, Halsey was willing to accept casualties in pursuit of decisive results. His famous signal to the Pacific Fleet, "Attack, repeat, attack," had become the operational philosophy that guided every American naval action in the Solomon Islands. Halsey understood that the Japanese held significant advantages in night fighting tactics and torpedo technology. Their long-lance torpedoes could strike targets at ranges exceeding 20 miles, far beyond the reach of American weapons. Japanese crews had trained extensively in night operations, using techniques that allowed them to coordinate attacks without radio communications that might reveal their positions. But Halsey also recognized that American advantages in radar technology and damage control procedures could offset these Japanese strengths. If American commanders were willing to press their attacks with sufficient determination, the strategic situation around Guadalcanal had evolved into what naval analysts would later recognize as a campaign of mutual attrition. Both sides were feeding ships and aircraft into a battle that neither could afford to lose, but neither seemed capable of winning decisively. The Japanese needed to recapture Henderson Field to secure their defensive perimeter in the Central Pacific. The Americans needed to hold Guadalcanal to maintain their offensive momentum toward the Japanese home islands. This strategic deadlock meant that every engagement, no matter how small, carried implications far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Aboard the Helena, Lieutenant Commander Bruce watched his radar operators track contacts that appeared and disappeared at the edge of their detection range. The ship's SG surface search radar could detect large vessels at distances approaching 20 miles under ideal conditions. But the mountainous terrain of the Solomon Islands created blind spots and false echoes that complicated the tactical picture. A skilled radar operator could distinguish between a genuine contact and a geographic return, but this skill came only through experience, and many of the Helena's crew were still learning the subtleties of their equipment. The Japanese, meanwhile, had developed their own methods for gathering intelligence about American movements. Their seaplane bases in the northern Solomons allowed them to conduct reconnaissance flights that could track American ships throughout the day. Japanese submarines maintained patrol stations along the likely routes that American forces would use to approach Guadalcanal. Most importantly, Japanese commanders had learned to coordinate their operations with the predictable patterns of American supply runs. The Tokyo Express missions that brought reinforcements and supplies to Japanese forces on Guadalcanal were timed to intercept American shipping at moments of maximum vulnerability. The crew of the Helena had witnessed the results of these Japanese tactics during previous engagements. They had seen American ships torpedoed and sunk before they could bring their guns to bear on the enemy. They had watched Japanese destroyers appear seemingly from nowhere, launch their torpedoes, and disappear back into the darkness before American forces could respond effectively. These experiences had taught them that survival in the waters around Guadalcanal required not just courage and skill, but also a thorough understanding of Japanese tactical methods. The daily routine aboard the Helena included briefings that helped the crew understand the broader strategic context of their operations. Captain Hoover believed that informed sailors fought more effectively than those who simply followed orders without understanding their purpose. During these briefings, the crew learned about Japanese troop movements on Guadalcanal itself, about the ongoing struggle for control of Henderson Field, about the supply convoys that both sides were running to sustain their forces in this remote corner of the Pacific. These briefings revealed the complex logistics that supported naval operations in the Solomon Islands. Every gallon of fuel oil, every round of ammunition, every spare part had to be transported thousands of miles from bases in Australia or the United States. The Helena's fuel tanks could carry enough oil to steam nearly 4,000 miles at cruising speed. But high-speed maneuvering during combat could consume fuel at rates that dramatically reduced the ship's operational range. Food supplies, fresh water, and medical supplies all had to be carefully managed to ensure that the ship could remain on station for extended periods without returning to base. The psychological demands of this type of warfare were perhaps even more challenging than the physical requirements. Sailors had to maintain their alertness and combat readiness while dealing with the constant uncertainty about when the next engagement might occur. They lived with the knowledge that enemy submarines might be tracking their movements, that enemy aircraft might appear without warning, that the next sunset might bring another night battle with outcomes that no one could predict. As afternoon settled over the Helena's anchorage, the crew continued their preparations for whatever the night might bring. They checked and rechecked their equipment. They studied recognition silhouettes of Japanese ships. They rehearsed the damage control procedures that might save their lives if enemy shells found their target. Each man understood that his individual performance might determine not just his own survival, but the survival of his shipmates and the success of their mission in these contested waters where the future of the Pacific War continued to unfold. The first clash. The preparations would be tested sooner than anyone expected. On the evening of November 12, 1942, intelligence reports began filtering through the communication networks of both fleets, reports that would set in motion one of the most brutal and confused naval engagements of the Pacific War. Admiral Tanaka's convoy was approaching once again, but this time the Japanese had committed something far more substantial than their usual fast cruiser runs. The intelligence was fragmentary, contradictory, but it painted a picture of a major naval force moving down what the Americans had begun calling the slot, that narrow corridor of water between the Solomon Islands that had become a highway for Japanese reinforcement efforts. Captain Hoover received the preliminary reports in Helena's Combat Information Center as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. The details were sparse, but the implications were clear. Tonight would not be another routine patrol. The Japanese were bringing heavy units, battleships, and their intention was not simply to deliver supplies and withdraw before dawn. They were coming to fight. The American response was swift, but necessarily improvised. Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan, flying his flag aboard the heavy cruiser San Francisco, would lead a mixed force of cruisers and destroyers into the confined waters north of Guadalcanal. It was a force assembled from available units rather than trained as a cohesive fighting team. Ships that had operated together before, but never as this particular tactical formation. Helena took her position in the battle line as the American force moved through the darkness toward the anticipated contact point. The arrangement was logical in theory. Destroyers forward and aft to provide torpedo attack capability and screening. The heavy cruisers San Francisco and Portland in the center to deliver the main gun battery firepower, and Helena with the other light cruisers positioned to support and exploit whatever opportunities the engagement might provide. But naval theory and naval reality in the confined, treacherous waters around Guadalcanal often diverged dramatically. The Japanese force that Admiral Tanaka was escorting included the battleships Hiei and Kirishima, massive vessels whose 14-inch guns could devastate any American cruiser at close range. But Tanaka's mission was complicated. He was simultaneously trying to protect his convoy of transport vessels and engage whatever American forces might interfere with the bombardment mission that was the primary objective of this operation. The tactical situation was inherently unstable. Both forces operating in restricted waters, both attempting to achieve multiple objectives simultaneously, both handicapped by the limitations of radar and visual identification in tropical darkness. Contact came at approximately 1:40 in the morning on November 13th. Helena's radar operators detected the approaching Japanese formation at a range that should have provided tactical advantage. Time to organize the American attack and concentrate firepower on selected targets. But the reality of night combat proved far more chaotic than any peacetime exercise had suggested. The identification problem became critical immediately. In the darkness and confusion, with ships maneuvering at high speed and radar contacts multiplying across the scope displays, distinguishing friend from enemy became a challenge that tested every aspect of training and experience. Helena's crew found themselves tracking multiple contacts, some closing rapidly, some appearing to be friendly units, some clearly hostile, but the tactical picture remained fragmented and unclear. Admiral Callahan's force had achieved the element of surprise, but translating that advantage into effective combat action required coordination and communication under the most demanding conditions imaginable. Radio circuits became congested with contact reports, course and speed changes, requests for identification, and increasingly urgent damage reports as the engagement intensified. The opening salvos came almost simultaneously from both forces, searchlights stabbing through the darkness, gun flashes illuminating the water in brief, brilliant moments that revealed the positions of ships and the trajectory of incoming fire. Helena's crew felt the concussion of their own guns firing, felt the ship heel under the force of emergency turns, felt the vibration of near misses as Japanese shells bracketed their position. The tactical formation that had seemed so carefully planned dissolved almost immediately into individual ship actions. The confined waters and the intensity of the engagement made coordinated maneuvers nearly impossible. Each captain found himself fighting his own battle, making split-second decisions based on incomplete information and the immediate threats facing his vessel. Helena's radar advantages became both blessing and curse in this environment. The ability to track multiple contacts provided tactical awareness, but it also created information overload in a situation where rapid decision-making was essential. Captain Hoover and his combat team found themselves processing dozens of contacts, trying to distinguish between friendly destroyers making torpedo runs, enemy cruisers closing for gun action, and the massive radar signatures of the Japanese battleships that dominated the electronic picture. The sound of naval combat at close range was unlike anything most of the crew had experienced. The crash of their own guns firing, the whistle and splash of incoming shells, the metallic impact of fragments against the ship's superstructure, the shouted orders and reports that competed with the noise of machinery and weapons. Each man focused on his immediate responsibilities while trying to maintain awareness of the larger tactical situation unfolding around them. Admiral Callahan's flagship San Francisco found herself engaged with the battleship Hiei at ranges so close that the Japanese vessel's massive guns could not depress sufficiently to engage effectively. But the secondary batteries and the guns of accompanying cruisers created a crossfire that tested every aspect of American damage control training. The heavy cruiser took hit after hit, her communication systems damaged, her command structure disrupted, but her crew continued to fight with a determination that reflected months of preparation for exactly this type of engagement. The destroyer actions developed their own deadly rhythm, high-speed approaches through the gun flashes and searchlight beams, torpedo launches at ranges where success or failure could be determined in minutes, emergency turns to avoid collision with friendly units or to escape the concentrated fire of Japanese heavy units. Each destroyer captain found himself balancing the aggressive tactics necessary for effective torpedo attack against the survival requirements of his ship and crew. Helena's contribution to this chaotic engagement reflected the months of training and preparation that had brought her crew to this moment. Steady, accurate gunfire directed at targets identified through the combination of radar contact and visual confirmation. Damage control procedures executed with precision when Japanese shells found their mark, and the seamless coordination between departments that allowed the ship to continue fighting effectively even as the tactical situation continued to deteriorate around them. The cost of this first major clash was becoming apparent even as the engagement continued. American ships taking heavy damage, Japanese vessels burning in the darkness, the careful tactical plans of both sides giving way to the brutal reality of close-range naval combat where survival often depended more on individual skill and determination than on strategic planning. Seekers, Aftermath and Reflection. By dawn, the waters around Savo Island bore witness to a scene that would haunt naval historians for generations. The USS Atlanta lay dead in the water, her superstructure a twisted mass of steel, Admiral Scott among the casualties of friendly fire in those first chaotic minutes. The destroyer USS Cushing drifted powerless, her engine room flooded, while the USS Laffey had simply disappeared beneath the dark waters, taking most of her crew with her. Captain Hoover aboard the Helena surveyed the damage reports flowing in from across the task force. 42 officers and men lost from his own ship, but they had been among the fortunate ones. The Japanese had paid their own terrible price. The battleship Hiei, pride of the Imperial Navy, lay crippled and burning, her steering gear destroyed by the concentrated fire of multiple American vessels in those final desperate minutes of the engagement. The human cost of modern naval warfare revealed itself in the most intimate details. Pharmacists' mates worked through the night in makeshift aid stations, their supplies quickly exhausted. Young sailors, many barely out of high school, found themselves applying tourniquets to shipmates they had shared coffee with just hours before. The smell of antiseptic mixed with the acrid smoke that still drifted across the anchorage, a reminder that survival in these waters came at a price measured not just in tonnage lost, but in lives forever changed. Lieutenant Commander Williams, the Helena's damage control officer, made his way through compartments still warm from near misses. Here, a bulkhead showed the spiderweb pattern of stress fractures from a shell impact. There, emergency lighting cast strange shadows where normal illumination had been destroyed. Each space told its own story of the night's violence, and of the skill and courage that had kept the ship afloat. The Japanese withdrawal left behind more than damaged vessels. In the waters between Guadalcanal and Savo Island, life rafts bobbed in the gentle swells, their occupants facing the particular vulnerability that comes with being utterly dependent on the sea. American and Japanese sailors alike found themselves reduced to the same fundamental struggle, staying alive until rescue could reach them. Petty Officer Nakamura, blown overboard from the destroyer Akatsuki in the battle's opening minutes, clung to debris from his ship's superstructure. The water was warm, but exhaustion was already setting in. Around him, other survivors called out in the darkness, their voices growing weaker as the hours passed. The arbitrary nature of survival at sea became starkly apparent. Why had the explosion thrown him clear while his bunkmate, standing just 3 feet away, had been crushed by falling steel? The rescue operations that followed revealed both the humanity and the harsh calculations of warfare. American destroyers moved carefully through the debris fields, their searchlights probing the water for survivors. International maritime law was clear about the obligation to rescue enemy sailors, but the constant threat of submarine attack made such operations desperately dangerous for the rescuing vessels. Captain Jenkins of the USS Fletcher faced one of those decisions that would stay with him for the rest of his life. His sonar operator had detected what might be a submarine contact, or might be the sound of settling wreckage. In the water ahead, his lookouts had spotted a cluster of Japanese survivors. The calculus was brutal in its simplicity. Risk his entire crew of 300 men to save perhaps 20 enemy sailors. The war would produce thousands of such moments. Individual decisions that tested the boundaries between military necessity and human compassion. The medical facilities at Henderson Field became a testament to the universality of suffering. American and Japanese wounded lay side by side in the makeshift hospital tents, their uniforms cut away to reveal injuries that knew no nationality. Navy corpsmen, many of them conscientious objectors who had volunteered for medical duty, worked with a quiet professionalism that transcended the political divisions that had brought these men to this remote island. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, one of the few Navy nurses stationed at Guadalcanal, found herself treating a young Japanese sailor whose destroyer had been sunk in the engagement. He couldn't have been more than 19, about the same age as her brother back in Ohio. The boy's eyes held the same mixture of fear and confusion she had seen in countless American wounded. Pain, she reflected, was perhaps the most democratic of human experiences. The letters home from Guadalcanal during those November days carried a weight that peacetime correspondence could never match. Sailors struggled to find words that could convey the reality of their experience without causing unbearable worry for families thousands of miles away. How do you tell your mother about watching good men die? How do you explain to a young wife that you've discovered reserves of courage you never knew you possessed, and depths of fear you never imagined? Seaman First Class Rodriguez sat in the Helena's mess hall, staring at a blank piece of paper. His family in San Antonio would be expecting news. But what could he tell them about the night just past? That modern naval combat was nothing like the heroic sea battles in the movies. That survival often came down to pure chance rather than skill or bravery. That he had seen men perform acts of extraordinary courage and others freeze completely under fire, and that both responses seemed equally human and understandable. The strategic implications of the battle were already being analyzed in the intelligence centers of both fleets. Admiral Halsey's staff worked through the night, piecing together the sequence of events from damage reports and survivor accounts. The Japanese had been turned back. Their attempt to bombard Henderson Field had failed, but the cost had been enormous, and similar engagements lay ahead. In the Japanese command bunkers on Rabaul, Admiral Yamamoto's staff conducted their own grim accounting. The loss of the Hiei was a devastating blow to Japanese prestige. Battleships were not supposed to be sunk by destroyer attacks in confused night actions. More troubling still was the evidence that American radar and gunnery were improving with each engagement. The technological advantage that had seemed so decisive at Pearl Harbor was gradually shifting to the other side. The sun rose on November 13th over waters still littered with the debris of battle. Oil slicks caught the morning light, creating rainbow patterns that seemed almost beautiful until you remembered their source. Empty life preservers drifted with the current, silent testimony to the men who had warned them just hours before. The sea, indifferent to human conflict, began its slow work of erasure. But the memories of that night would remain with the survivors forever. In the weeks that followed, both sides would claim victory in the first naval battle of Guadalcanal. The Americans had prevented the bombardment of Henderson Field, but at a cost in ships and men that raised serious questions about tactical doctrine. The Japanese had demonstrated their continued willingness to accept enormous risks, but had failed to achieve their strategic objective. Perhaps the truest measure of the engagement was simpler. It had revealed once again the terrible human cost of the decision to settle international disputes through violence. The young men who survived would carry those November nights with them for the rest of their lives, a reminder of their own mortality and of the precious nature of the peace they were fighting to restore. Beneath the waves, below the surface of what would forever be known as Iron Bottom Sound, a different kind of transformation was already beginning. The waters that had witnessed such violence were gradually reclaiming the instruments of war, drawing them down into the silent depths where currents moved with ancient patience. The USS Atlanta rested in 240 feet of water, her broken hull settling into the sandy bottom with the weight of finality. Already within hours of her sinking, the ocean had begun its work of transformation. Salt water moved through compartments that had once echoed with the voices of young sailors, flooding spaces where men had lived, worked, and died in service to something larger than themselves. In the weeks that followed, marine life began to discover these new structures on the ocean floor. Small fish, curious and opportunistic, explored the twisted metal frameworks that had once been gun mounts and bridge wings. The ocean, indifferent to the human purposes these vessels had served, saw only new habitat, new shelter in waters that had been empty bottom just days before. The Japanese destroyer Akatsuki lay nearby, her elegant lines broken by the violence of her final moments. Her forward magazine had exploded with such force that debris from her superstructure was scattered across hundreds of yards of sea floor. Yet even here, life was finding purchase. Coral polyps, carried by the currents from distant reefs, began their slow work of colonization, settling on steel surfaces that would, over decades, become the foundation for entirely new ecosystems. These wrecks held secrets that would remain hidden for generations. In the Atlanta's radio room, code books still rested in their weighted bags. Documents that had once contained the most sensitive intelligence of the Pacific War, now slowly dissolving in the salt water, personal effects of the crew, photographs of sweethearts, letters from home, small mementos that had connected these young men to the world they had left behind, all gradually surrendering to the patient chemistry of the sea. The ocean floor around Guadalcanal was becoming a vast underwater museum of the Pacific War. Each wreck told its own story of tactical decisions made in split seconds, of courage displayed in moments of terror, of the terrible efficiency with which modern weapons could transform proud warships into twisted metal and human tragedy. Admiral Callahan's flagship, the USS San Francisco, had survived that November night, but dozens of her crew had not. Their bodies, committed to the sea with military honors, had found their final rest in these same waters. The ocean that had claimed so many would hold them with the same indifferent embrace it offered to enemy sailors. A reminder that the sea recognizes no flags, no national allegiances in its depths. As months passed, the wrecks began to change in ways that would have amazed the men who had sailed them into battle. Schools of tropical fish made homes in what had once been ammunition storage compartments. Sea fans grew from the barrels of 5-inch guns that had fired thousands of rounds in anger. The bridge of a destroyer, where officers had made life-and-death decisions in the chaos of night combat, became a shelter for octopi and moray eels. The transformation was both beautiful and haunting. Nature was demonstrating its capacity to heal, to create life and beauty even from the instruments of destruction. Yet the wrecks also served as monuments to the young men who had died there, permanent markers of sacrifice that would outlast any memorial constructed on land. Local fishermen, members of the indigenous communities who had witnessed the great naval battles from their hidden positions on shore, began to notice changes in their traditional fishing grounds. Areas that had been productive for generations were now marked by the presence of these steel monuments. The ocean's currents, deflected by the wrecks, created new patterns of sedimentation and marine life distribution. In the deeper waters where the larger ships had settled, the pressure and darkness created an environment of profound stillness. Here, the USS Atlanta's main battery turrets, torn from their mountings by the force of Japanese shells, rested like fallen monuments to American industrial might. The sophisticated fire control equipment that had represented the cutting edge of naval technology was slowly being consumed by marine organisms that had no understanding of its former complexity. The Japanese vessels told similar stories of technological ambition humbled by the sea. The destroyer Udachi, her hull split open by American gunfire, had spilled her contents across the sea floor. Depth charges and torpedoes that would never reach their intended targets, navigation equipment that would never again guide a ship through dangerous waters, personal belongings of sailors who had died far from their homeland. These underwater graveyards would remain largely undisturbed for decades. The technology to explore such depths safely did not yet exist, and even if it had, the waters around Guadalcanal remained contested territory where the living continued to fight for control of strategic positions. The dead beneath the waves waited in patient silence while the war continued above them. Years would pass before historians and marine archaeologists could begin to piece together the full story of what had happened in those chaotic November nights. The wrecks themselves would become primary sources, their damage patterns telling stories that no surviving witness could completely reconstruct. The ocean had become both cemetery and archive, preserving the evidence of human conflict while slowly, inexorably, reclaiming it for purposes entirely removed from war. In the silence of the depths, where no sound of battle could ever again disturb the peace, the young men who had fought so bravely found their final rest, their sacrifice marked not by marble monuments, but by the slow, patient work of coral growth and the gentle movements of fish among the ruins of their ships. The unsung heroes. Above these silent depths, far from the coral gardens that now claimed the fallen ships, the war continued. But it was fought by men who carried within them something far more powerful than any weapon in their arsenal. They carried the memory of their lost shipmates, and with it, a quiet determination that transformed ordinary sailors into something approaching the extraordinary. On Henderson Field, where Marine ground crews worked through the sweltering heat to keep damaged aircraft operational, Navy mechanics found themselves working alongside men they'd never met before Guadalcanal. Petty Officer Second Class Martinez from the Helena's engine room had somehow ended up helping repair Wildcat fighters. His hands, trained on turbine systems, proving remarkably adept at aircraft hydraulics. The institutional boundaries that had seemed so important in peacetime simply dissolved under the practical necessities of keeping machines running and men alive. These were not the heroes whose names would appear in newspaper headlines. Martinez would never receive a medal for the 18-hour shifts he pulled, keeping fighters airworthy with improvised parts and borrowed tools. But his squadron commander noted in his diary that the quiet sailor from the sunken cruiser had probably saved more lives than any single combat action, simply by ensuring that planes could fly when they were needed most. The stories multiplied across the theater of operations. Hospital Corpsman Thompson, who had pulled 3 wounded Japanese sailors from the water during the aftermath of the night battle, found himself learning basic Japanese phrases to comfort enemy wounded. The irony was not lost on him, that in the midst of a war fought with such technological brutality, human compassion required no translation. His patients taught him words for water and home, while he shared pictures of his family in Iowa, finding common ground in the universal language of young men far from everything familiar. Back in Pearl Harbor, where the Helena's survivors had been temporarily assigned to new ships and shore duties, Chief Petty Officer Williams discovered that his real expertise lay not in gunnery direction, but in helping new recruits understand what they might face. He spoke to them not of glory or heroism, but of the importance of knowing the man standing next to you, of checking on your shipmates during the quiet watches, of sharing coffee when supplies ran low, of writing letters home for men whose hands shook too badly to hold a pen steady. Williams never used the word fear in these conversations. Instead, he talked about respect. Respect for the ocean, for the enemy's capabilities, for the awesome destructive power of modern weapons. But mostly, he emphasized respect for the ordinary human beings who found themselves asked to do extraordinary things. The ocean doesn't care about your rank, he would tell them, and neither does a torpedo. What matters is whether you can count on the man next to you, and whether he can count on you. The administrative machinery of war had no category for these contributions. There were commendations for conspicuous gallantry, for exceptional devotion to duty, for heroism above and beyond the call, but no recognition for the quiet acts of humanity that actually sustained men through the grinding reality of prolonged combat. Seaman Rodriguez, who had lost his best friend in the Helena's magazine explosion, began writing letters to the families of men who died without anyone to remember their last words. It became his personal mission, ensuring that mothers and wives received some final message, even if he had to invent appropriate last thoughts for men who had simply vanished in the chaos of battle. These letters required a delicate balance of truth and mercy. Rodriguez learned to write of courage without describing terror, of quick deaths that might not have been quick, of final thoughts that honored the memory of home without dwelling on the reality of violent endings. His division officer, Lieutenant Commander Hayes, eventually discovered this unauthorized correspondence and quietly arranged for official stationery and postage, understanding that some duties transcended regulations. The Japanese forces facing them across the contested waters carried similar burdens, though their cultural expressions differed. Captured documents would later reveal comparable acts of quiet heroism, junior officers sharing their rations with enlisted men, veteran petty officers teaching young sailors to write death poems that honored their families while accepting their probable fate, medical personnel treating captured American airmen with the same care they provided their own wounded, war correspondents searching for dramatic narratives that would resonate with home-front audiences often missed these subtler stories. The public wanted tales of decisive action, of clear victories and identifiable villains. But the men actually fighting the war understood that survival depended more on countless small acts of mutual support than on any individual moment of battlefield heroism. They learned to find meaning not in grand strategic objectives, but in the simple fact that they could still help each other maintain their humanity under circumstances designed to strip it away. As the weeks passed and new battles replaced the memories of old ones, these ordinary sailors discovered that their greatest victory was not over any enemy fleet, but over the persistent temptation to let war transform them into something less than human. They chose, again and again, to remain men who happened to be fighting, rather than warriors who had forgotten how to be men. In the vast Pacific, where individual ships seemed insignificant against the enormous distances and endless blue horizons, they created small communities of mutual care that proved more durable than steel hulls, and more powerful than any weapon in either navy's arsenal. Sunset over Iron Bottom Sound. The peace that followed would prove more enduring than any of those young sailors could have imagined in their darkest moments. As the months turned to years after Guadalcanal, the strategic initiative that began in those contested waters would carry Allied forces across thousands of miles of Pacific Ocean. Each island campaign, each amphibious assault, each carrier battle built upon the foundation laid in Iron Bottom Sound, where American forces first proved they could meet the Imperial Japanese Navy in surface combat and emerge victorious. The lessons learned in those chaotic night battles would reshape naval doctrine for generations. The importance of radar integration, the need for clear communication protocols under combat stress, the value of aggressive leadership balanced with tactical flexibility. Admiral Halsey's philosophy of calculated audacity would influence American naval thinking long after the last shot was fired. But perhaps more importantly, the human bonds forged in those desperate hours would demonstrate something profound about the nature of courage itself. Captain Hoover's decision to rescue Japanese survivors, the countless acts of compassion between enemies, the quiet heroism of ordinary sailors who chose humanity over hatred. These moments created ripples that extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. They established precedents for how civilized nations might conduct themselves even in the midst of total war. The Geneva Conventions, the development of international humanitarian law, the very concept of war crimes prosecution, all drew strength from the recognition that some things must remain sacred even when everything else seems lost. In the decades that followed, former enemies would become allies. Japanese and American veterans would meet at reunion ceremonies, sharing stories, comparing experiences, finding common ground in their shared understanding of what combat truly costs. The strategic partnership that emerged between Japan and the United States would become one of the most stable and productive relationships in the post-war world. Trade routes that once carried invasion fleets would carry commercial vessels, cultural exchanges, technological innovations that benefited both nations. The waters around Guadalcanal grew quiet, but they were never forgotten. Marine archaeologists would eventually explore the wrecks that Captain Hoover and his contemporaries left behind, documenting not just the tactical details of each engagement, but the human stories embedded in twisted metal and scattered debris. Personal effects recovered from the ocean floor, letters never sent, photographs of sweethearts and families. These artifacts would remind future generations that every strategic decision, every tactical maneuver, every statistical casualty report represented individual human lives with hopes and dreams and fears, no different from their own. Henderson Field itself would evolve from a desperate outpost into a symbol of Allied determination. The runway that cost so many lives to capture and defend would eventually serve civilian aircraft, connecting the Solomon Islands to the broader Pacific community, facilitating economic development and cultural exchange that would have seemed impossible during those dark months of 1942. The irony was not lost on historians, that an airfield built for bombers and fighters would ultimately serve as a gateway for tourism, education, humanitarian aid. The strategic principles validated at Guadalcanal would influence military thinking for generations. The importance of air superiority, the vulnerability of extended supply lines, the decisive role of intelligence and logistics in modern warfare. These lessons would be studied at staff colleges around the world. But the human lessons proved equally valuable. The recognition that individual moral choices matter even in the midst of vast impersonal forces. That small acts of decency can preserve essential humanity when everything else seems to encourage brutality. That courage is not the absence of fear, but the determination to do what is right despite fear. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon on this particular evening, decades after the last shot was fired, Iron Bottom Sound reflected the golden light with perfect serenity. The water that once churned with shell splashes and burning fuel oil now lapped gently against coral reefs, where tropical fish had long since made their homes among the scattered remains of war. Coconut palms swayed in the trade winds, their fronds rustling with a sound like distant applause for all those who had served, and all those who had chosen to remember them with honor rather than hatred. A small fishing boat moved slowly across the sound, its engine puttering quietly as the crew prepared their nets for the evening catch. The fishermen were descendants of the Melanesian peoples who had witnessed the great battles, who had hidden in jungle caves while foreign navies fought for control of their ancestral waters, who had emerged to help rescue survivors regardless of which flag they served under. Their presence now, pursuing the timeless occupation of their ancestors, represented a kind of victory that no admiral could have planned and no strategy could have guaranteed. The peace was not merely the absence of conflict, but the presence of something positive and constructive. Schools where children learned about the world beyond their islands. Hospitals equipped with modern medical technology. Communication systems that connected isolated communities to global networks of knowledge and opportunity. The infrastructure of war had been transformed into the foundation of prosperity, proving that human ingenuity could create as effectively as it could destroy. On the horizon, a commercial airliner traced a contrail across the deepening sky, carrying passengers between nations that had once been mortal enemies. The flight path took it directly over the spot where the USS Helena had fought her last battle, where Captain Hoover had made his crucial decisions about rescue and retreat, where ordinary sailors had discovered extraordinary reserves of courage and compassion. The passengers above were mostly unaware of the history beneath them, but their very presence represented the fulfillment of hopes that had seemed impossible during the darkest hours of the Pacific War. The sun touched the water now, painting the entire sound in shades of gold and crimson that would have taken any sailor's breath away. This was the same sun that had risen on young men preparing for battle, that had set on the aftermath of desperate engagements, that had witnessed both the worst and best of human nature played out on these contested waters. But now it illuminated a scene of perfect tranquility, where the only sounds were the gentle lapping of waves, the distant call of seabirds, the quiet conversation of fishermen preparing for their evening work. In the gathering dusk, lights began to appear along the shoreline, electric lights powered by generators and solar panels. Not the harsh glare of searchlights seeking targets, but the warm glow of homes where families gathered for dinner, where children did homework, where elderly grandparents told stories of the time when great ships fought battles that shook the earth. These lights represented the ultimate victory, not of one nation over another, but of civilization over chaos, of hope over despair, of the human capacity to build and nurture and create beauty, even in places where terrible destruction had once reigned supreme. The stars began to emerge as the last light faded from the western sky, the same constellations that had guided navigators through dangerous waters, that had provided reference points for gunnery calculations, that had offered comfort to homesick sailors far from everything familiar, now shone down on a world transformed. The Southern Cross, Orion, the Pleiades, eternal witnesses to human struggle and human triumph, eternal reminders that individual lives and individual choices matter in ways that extend far beyond immediate circumstances. And in the perfect stillness of Iron Bottom Sound, where the water reflected starlight like scattered diamonds, the past and present merged into a single moment of profound peace. The young sailors who had fought and died here would always be remembered, not just for their sacrifice, but for their example. They had proven that ordinary people could rise to extraordinary challenges, that courage and compassion could coexist even under the most extreme pressure, that the bonds between human beings could transcend the artificial divisions created by politics and nationalism and ideology. The sound itself had become a monument more enduring than bronze or marble, a living testament to the possibility of redemption and reconciliation, a reminder that even the darkest chapters of human history could be transformed into foundations for something better. As the night deepened and the stars grew brighter, Iron Bottom Sound held its secrets and its stories, its tragedies and its triumphs, in the gentle embrace of eternal tides that had witnessed everything and forgiven everything, and would continue flowing long after all the participants in these great events had passed into history and legend and peaceful rest. Madracha, radar sweep. But time moves in circles as well as lines, and in the radar room of the USS Helena, hours before that first terrible battle, Seaman First Class Tommy Chen hunched over the green glow of his scope, watching phosphorescent blips dance across the circular screen like fireflies in an electronic meadow. The air hummed with the steady pulse of the rotating antenna above, sweeping the dark waters in methodical arcs, searching for the enemy fleet that intelligence promised would come. Chen had been trained at the Navy's new radar school in Hawaii, part of a generation learning to fight with invisible beams instead of telescopes and instinct. The technology was so classified that even the word radar was forbidden. Officially, it was radio detection and ranging, but the sailors simply called it the magic eye. Tonight, that eye would determine who lived and who died in the waters off Savo Island. Contact bearing 270, range 12,000 yards. Chen's voice carried the practiced calm of countless training exercises, but his hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the gain control. Behind him, Lieutenant Morrison plotted the bearing on the dead reckoning tracer, converting electronic signals into tactical reality. The Japanese force was larger than expected, more ships, moving faster than the estimates suggested. In radar rooms across the American formation, other operators stared at similar screens, each man a crucial link in the chain of modern naval warfare. They were the new sentries, replacing the lookouts in crows' nests who had watched for enemy sails across centuries of maritime conflict. Their green screens held life and death, victory and defeat, in patterns of light that pulsed with each sweep of the invisible beam, reaching out into darkness, touching metal hulls, bouncing back with whispered warnings of approaching battle. Gun turret. While radar operators tracked the approaching enemy fleet on their glowing screens, another kind of preparation was taking place deep within the ship's armored heart. Inside Turret 2 of the USS Helena, 6 men moved through their final checks with practiced precision, their world reduced to steel walls, hydraulic systems, and the massive 16-inch guns that would soon speak with thunder. Gunner's mate First Class Rodriguez ran his hand along the breech mechanism, feeling for any irregularity in the smooth metal surface. The turret's interior hummed with quiet mechanical energy, motors maintaining pressure, ammunition hoists standing ready, range-finding equipment calibrated to mathematical perfection. Each man knew his role in the intricate dance of modern gunnery, where split-second timing meant the difference between hitting an enemy destroyer or watching shells splash harmlessly into dark water. The turret captain studied his firing solutions, angles and distances calculated by the ship's mechanical computers, then verified by human experience and intuition. Below them, in the magazine spaces, other sailors handled the massive shells with reverent care, each projectile representing months of American industrial effort. Steel forged in Pittsburgh, explosives mixed in distant factories, all culminating in this moment of potential release. As the range to the enemy fleet continued to close, the turret's hydraulic systems began their slow rotation, tracking the predicted intercept course. The gun barrels, each weighing more than a locomotive, moved with surprising grace, their movement controlled by sailors who understood that their weapons represented not just destructive power, but the accumulated knowledge of centuries of naval gunnery. From the bronze cannons of ancient galleys to these precision instruments of modern warfare, in the confined space, breathing became deeper, more deliberate, as each man prepared for the moment when their careful preparation would transform into violent action, when the turret would shake with controlled explosion, and their shells would arc across the darkness toward distant targets. Bridge at night. On the bridge above, Captain Hoover stood silhouetted against the faint starlight, his binoculars sweeping methodically across the black horizon where sea met sky in an invisible seam. The bridge was his command center, but also his burden, where every decision would ripple through the ship below and determine the fate of 600 souls. Behind him, the plotting table showed their position in the narrow waters between Savo Island and Cape Esperance, a tactical funnel where maneuver room was limited and escape routes few. The quartermaster updated their course and speed in whispered reports, while the officer of the deck coordinated the steady stream of information flowing up from the Combat Information Center. Hoover's mind processed multiple streams of data simultaneously: wind direction affecting gun accuracy, current drift influencing torpedo spreads, the precise timing required to coordinate with other ships in the formation. Years of naval training had prepared him for this moment, yet no amount of peacetime exercises could fully replicate the weight of command in actual combat. The bridge watch maintained their vigilant routine, lookouts scanning assigned sectors, signalmen ready with their hooded lights, the helmsman's steady hands on the wheel maintaining their heading with mechanical precision. Each man understood that their captain's decisions would be only as good as the information they provided, that their collective awareness formed the ship's sensory system in these dangerous waters. Through his binoculars, Hoover could see the faint wakes of other American ships, ghostly phosphorescent trails marking their passage through the tropical sea. The formation was proceeding according to plan. But plans had a way of dissolving once the shooting started, when individual ship commanders would need to rely on training, instinct, and the courage of their crews to see them through the chaos that was about to unfold. Life raft. The chaos that Hoover anticipated came with devastating swiftness. And within hours of that careful formation, many of those same sailors found themselves alone in the dark Pacific waters. The USS Atlanta had taken a torpedo, her forward magazines erupting in a pillar of flame that briefly turned night into day, while the destroyer USS Cushing drifted powerless, her engine room flooded, her crew preparing to abandon ship. Seaman First Class Martinez clung to a piece of decking, the oil-slicked water warm against his life jacket as he watched the distant flashes of continuing battle. The sound carried strangely across the water, the sharp crack of 5-inch guns, the deeper rumble of battleship salvos, punctuated by moments of eerie silence when the wind shifted and carried the noise away. Around him, other survivors called out in the darkness, voices disembodied and desperate, trying to find shipmates, trying to stay together in the vast emptiness. Martinez had trained for this scenario, but no training could prepare you for the profound loneliness of floating in a hostile sea, watching your ship burn on the horizon, wondering if rescue would come before exhaustion or exposure claimed you. Yet even in these desperate moments, the bonds forged in months of shared service held firm. Chief Petty Officer Williams, despite his own wounds, moved methodically through the scattered survivors, organizing them into groups, sharing water from emergency rations, keeping morale alive with quiet words of encouragement. "The destroyers will be back for us," he promised, his voice steady despite the uncertainty. "They know where we went down." In the distance, the battle raged on, but here among the survivors, a different kind of courage emerged, the quiet determination to endure, to support one another, to maintain hope when hope seemed as distant as the stars reflected in the oil-darkened water around their makeshift life raft of debris and determination. Chaplain service, days later, when the rescue ships had gathered the living and the sea had claimed the fallen. Chaplain Morrison stood on the deck of the USS President Jackson as she moved slowly through the waters of Iron Bottom Sound. The morning sun cast long shadows across the assembled sailors. Men from different ships, different battles, united now in remembrance of those who would not return home. "We commit their bodies to the deep," the chaplain's voice carried across the water, steady and sure, while the engines hummed their quiet requiem. The survivors stood at attention, some still bearing bandages from their ordeal, their faces reflecting not just grief, but a profound understanding of sacrifice freely given. Captain Hoover, rescued after 18 hours in the water, watched as white flowers drifted away from the ship, each blossom a prayer, a promise, a recognition that courage takes many forms. Some men fight with guns and steel, others with quiet words in dark water, all serving something greater than themselves. The chaplain spoke of young radio men who stayed at their posts, of gunners who loaded shells until the sea claimed their turrets, of ordinary sailors who became extraordinary in their final moments. His words drifted over the sound like the flowers, settling gently on waters that had witnessed so much, that now held so many stories beneath their deceptively peaceful surface. As the service concluded, the ships turned toward home, leaving behind waters that would forever remember. And in that remembrance, the fallen sailors found their eternal watch, their sacrifice woven into the very currents of the Pacific, where the morning light danced on waves that whispered of courage, of brotherhood, of young men who answered when their moment came, and in answering, became part of something timeless, something that would endure long after the last echo of battle faded into the endless, peaceful, eternal blue.